The stagecoach from Denver rolled into Willow Creek, Montana territory on a Friday afternoon in October, 7 days behind schedule. And the first thing Rebecca Hale did when the door swung open was apologize for her appearance before anyone had the chance to react to it. She said, "I know I am not what the letter described. There was a rock slide past Bridger Pass, and I have been in this dress for 13 days, and I would like to explain if someone will let me before any decisions are made." Nathaniel Cole stood at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the woman climbing down from the stage, and for a moment he did not say anything at all. The hem of her traveling dress was torn through at the side seam, dust-stained past the knee, and one of her gloves had worn clean through at the fingertips. Her trunk, when the driver set it down, had a cracked corner and had clearly been thrown more than once. She was 29 years old, with dark hair coming loose from its pins, and she stood very straight despite all of it. The way a person stands when standing straight is the only thing left that they can control. Nathaniel had been told in 4 letters exchanged over 3 months with a placement office in Denver that Rebecca Hale was a capable woman of sound character, recently widowed, seeking a new situation in the territory. He had not been told what 13 days on a delayed stage through mountain weather would do to a person's appearance, because nobody writes that in a letter, and he had not thought to ask. What matters before anything else happens is what Nathaniel did next. He did not say anything about the dress. He did not comment on the trunk or the glove. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said, "You've come a hard way. Let's get you warm before we talk about anything else." That was all. It was not much, but it was the right amount. And Rebecca, who had been bracing for something else entirely, felt something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time in 13 days. Then a small voice said, from somewhere near Nathaniel's knee, where a child had been standing quietly enough that Rebecca had not noticed her, "Please be our mama." The girl was perhaps 5 years old, in a faded yellow pinafore, with the particular steady gaze of a child who has learned to watch adults carefully, because adults are where information comes from.
Had said it simply, the way children say things, without any sense that it might be too much or too soon. She had been told a new mother might be coming. She had been waiting at the fence since noon, and here was a woman in torn traveling clothes who looked tired and kind, and the girl had said the thing she had been holding since breakfast. Nathaniel went very still. Rebecca looked down at the child, and neither adult knew in that moment what to do with what the girl had just said out loud in front of both of them before either of them had spoken a single word to each other beyond a greeting. A 7-day delay on the Bridger Pass road was not unusual for that season, when early snow could close a route for days at a stretch. What this meant practically for a woman traveling alone with one trunk and a modest sum set aside for meals was that she ran out of clean clothing by day 5, ran low on money by day 9, and arrived by day 13 looking exactly like what 13 days of that journey would produce. Rebecca Hale had been a school teacher in a small town outside St. Louis before her husband died of a fever 2 years earlier. She had taught for 5 years before marrying and had gone back to it after, in the same schoolhouse, surrounded by people who had known her as a wife and now knew her as a widow and treated her with the particular gentle distance that small towns reserve for women whose situation has changed in a way nobody quite knows how to discuss. She had answered a placement notice in a St. Louis paper in the early spring. The notice had been placed by Nathaniel Cole, a rancher in Montana Territory with 2 children, a girl of 5 and a boy of 9, whose wife had died the previous winter of a lung fever that had taken most of a hard season to run its course. The notice did not say all of this. It said, "Rancher, 2 children, seeks capable woman for marriage and household management, references required." Rebecca had written back. Nathaniel had written back. 4 letters each over 3 months, careful and a little formal, the way letters are between 2 people deciding something large based on paper and handwriting and the small things a person reveals without meaning to.
What Rebecca had learned from the letters, Nathaniel Cole ran cattle and a modest string of horses on land his father had claimed. His daughter was named Grace, and his son was named Caleb. He wrote plainly, without much ornament, and had mentioned in his third letter that Grace had taken to asking when the new mother was coming, which she had not quite known how to answer, and thought Rebecca should know the children were aware of the arrangement and had feelings about it. What Nathaniel had learned from the letters, Rebecca had taught school for 8 years total. She had no children of her own. She described herself as steady, and said she did not need things to be easy, only honest. She had asked in her second letter what the children liked, which Nathaniel had not expected anyone to ask, and he had written back a longer answer than he intended about Grace's habit of naming every stray barn cat after a wildflower, and Caleb's fascination with the railroad surveys passing through the county. Neither of them had described what they looked like. Neither of them had asked. The problem, if there was one, was that Nathaniel had formed a picture in his mind anyway, made of nothing but careful handwriting and practical sentences. The picture had not included dust or a torn hem, or 13 days of a journey that had clearly taken something out of her that would need replacing. Grace Cole had formed a picture too. Hers had nothing to do with appearance. It was built entirely from one sentence in her father's second letter, read aloud because she had asked what the new lady said. The sentence was, "She asked what you like." Grace had turned this over for 3 months. A grown woman, a stranger in a place far away, had asked a question about Grace specifically. Grace decided, on the strength of that single sentence, that this was a person worth waiting at the fence for. The ranch house stood 2 miles from town, and Nathaniel drove the wagon while Rebecca sat beside him, with Grace wedged between them, and Caleb, who was 9 and considerably more reserved than his sister, rode alongside on a pony he was technically too small for, but rode anyway, because Nathaniel had decided some rules were not worth the argument. Grace talked the entire way. She talked about the barn cats, whose flower names Rebecca recognized immediately from Nathaniel's letter, which pleased Grace enormously because it meant the lady had read about them and remembered. She talked about the schoolhouse in town, which she attended when the roads allowed. She mentioned her mother briefly in the unself-conscious way young children sometimes speak of loss, stating it as a fact among other facts. "My mother got sick in the winter, and then she didn't get better, and Caleb doesn't like to talk about it, but I do sometimes." Rebecca listened with the particular attentiveness of a former school teacher who has spent years learning that children say the most important things sideways, folded into chatter about cats and schoolhouses, and that the right response is not to seize on the important thing, but to receive it at the same volume as everything else, so the child knows it was heard without feeling they handed over something too large. She said, when Grace mentioned her mother, "That sounds like it was a very hard winter." Grace said it was, and then, without any visible transition, she went back to the cats. Nathaniel said very little during the ride, but he heard all of it, and something in his shoulders, set in a careful way since the stage pulled in, eased slightly. At the house, Nathaniel showed Rebecca to the room prepared for her, clean and simple, with a jar of late wildflowers on the small dresser, arranged with the slightly chaotic abundance of someone who had picked every bloom within reach rather than a careful few. Rebecca looked at them a moment. "Did you pick these, Grace?" Grace, hovering in the doorway, nodded. "Thank you," Rebecca said. "They're lovely." Grace beamed and ran off to find Caleb and report on the flowers' success. That evening, after the children were asleep, Rebecca asked if she might use the kitchen table for an hour before retiring. Nathaniel said of course, and asked if she needed anything. "Just a needle and thread if you have them, and a lamp." She spent the hour mending a second dress from her trunk, the better of the 2 she had brought, torn at the shoulder seam somewhere around day 10 when the trunk had shifted against her. She worked carefully by lamplight, and
Nathaniel, who came back for a glass of water and stayed longer than the water required, watched her for a while without saying much. Eventually, he said, "You don't have to do that tonight." "I know, but I'd like to look like myself tomorrow. Today, I looked like 13 days on a stage. Tomorrow, I'd like to look like a person who is choosing to be here, because I am, and I'd like that to be visible." He was quiet a moment. "For what it's worth, you didn't need to apologize at the station about the dress." "I know I didn't need to," she said, not looking up from the seam. "I wanted to, before anyone had to be polite about it. It's easier that way, for me, I mean, not for you." "I understand that," he said, and he did, more than she perhaps expected, because he had spent the last year being careful about his own grief in front of people who wanted to be polite about it, and he recognized the impulse. He sat with her a while longer as she finished the seam. Neither said much else. The lamp burned low and the house was quiet in the particular way a house is quiet when there are sleeping children in it and the day has run longer than anyone expected. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, Rebecca was already in the kitchen, and Nathaniel found her there when he came in from the early chores, with a cup of coffee already poured and set at his place, without comment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know, I wanted to see the kitchen properly in daylight, and I think better with something in my hands. The coffee was incidental." He sat and drank it and found it was good, better than his own, and said so, and she said that was a low bar to clear, which made him laugh before he'd quite decided to. Over the following days, Rebecca took stock of the household the way a person does when they intend to stay rather than pass through. She found the root cellar disorganized in a way that suggested nobody had properly sorted it since the previous fall, and spent an afternoon setting it right, arranging what would spoil soonest toward the front. Nathaniel, coming across her at the task, said only that his late wife had kept it the same way. Rebecca said that was the sensible way to do it, and neither of them made anything further of the comparison, though both noticed it had been made without flinching. Caleb, careful in the way older children sometimes are after a loss, about investing in things that might not last, took longer than his sister to warm. Rebecca noticed and did not push. She simply made herself reliably present. Breakfast on time, his shirts mended before he noticed they were torn, his questions about the railroad surveys answered with more detail than he expected anyone to have. It was Caleb, in the second week, who first called her by name without the careful formality he'd been using. He asked at supper, "Rebecca, did you ever see a real survey crew work or just read about it?" And Rebecca, recognizing the small shift for what it was, answered as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which it rapidly was becoming. The marriage took place 9 days after Rebecca's arrival at the small church in Willow Creek, with the minister and 4 witnesses, the standard for arrangements like this in the territory, treated by everyone present with a practical seriousness that did not require romance in order to be valid. What matters is not the wedding itself, brief and unremarkable, but the 7 weeks that followed, because that is where the real story sits. Rebecca ran the household with the competence the placement office had promised and Nathaniel had hoped for without quite believing in. She took over Grace and Caleb's lessons on the days weather kept them from the schoolhouse, and within a month, Caleb, once indifferent to reading, was working through 3 books from Rebecca's trunk about Western exploration because she had noticed what he liked and simply made sure those were the books available. She and Nathaniel developed a working rhythm that was, on the surface, exactly what the arrangement had promised. A household run well, children cared for, 2 adults sharing a roof and a set of responsibilities with mutual respect and no friction worth mentioning. What neither of them mentioned for 7 weeks was whether there was anything beyond that. They were, by any practical measure, partners. But there was a carefulness between them that had not worn off the way Nathaniel had perhaps expected. They did not speak of his first wife beyond
what the children mentioned naturally. They did not speak of her late husband beyond the bare fact of his death, mentioned once, briefly, which Nathaniel had not pressed on. Grace, who at 5 had none of the carefulness the adults were practicing, asked Rebecca directly one afternoon while they hung washing whether she loved her father. Rebecca, caught without preparation, said, "I think your father and I are still getting to know each other, Grace. That takes time." Grace considered this. "You held his hand at the wedding. That's part of the ceremony. You held it longer than the ceremony needed." Rebecca had no answer to that. She finished the washing in silence, and that evening at supper found herself watching Nathaniel in a way she had been trying not to. The way he listened when Caleb explained something at length about the horses with complete attention and no impatience. The way he had, the week before, noticed Grace's boots worn through at the toe before anyone said a word, and simply come back from town the next day with new ones, without making anything of it. She thought about what Grace had said. She had held his hand longer than the ceremony needed. She had not noticed herself doing it at the time. It was a Thursday evening in late November, 7 weeks after Rebecca's arrival, and the pattern repeated almost exactly. The children asleep, Rebecca at the kitchen table mending one of Caleb's shirts rather than her own dress, and Nathaniel coming in for water and staying. He sat across from her, as he had taken to doing most evenings, and for a while neither spoke. The lamp burned low. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was settling over the yard, and somewhere in the dark, the cattle were shifting and quieting for the night. Nathaniel said, eventually, in the careful tone he used when he'd been thinking about something a while, "Grace asked me something today. She wanted to know if I was going to marry you properly. I told her we already had. She said that wasn't what she meant." Rebecca's hands went still on the sewing. She didn't look up right away. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd have to ask you because it wasn't only my answer to give." Rebecca set the sewing down. She looked at him. The lamp made the kitchen small and warm, a circle of light with a dark, frosted night pressing just outside the window, and inside that circle, for the first time since the platform 7 weeks before, neither of them was being careful.
"When I stepped off that stage," she said, "I apologized for how I looked before you'd even said hello. I'd spent 13 days rehearsing that apology because I was certain whatever I looked like would be the first thing you saw, and I wanted to get ahead of it. You didn't say a word about it. You said I'd come a hard way, and you wanted me warm. And then Grace said what she said, and I think, if I'm honest, that was the moment I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "I had a picture in my head from the letters of what this would be. You didn't match it when you got off the stage, but somewhere in the last 7 weeks, I stopped thinking about the picture at all, because the real version turned out to be better than what I'd imagined. I didn't notice that happening until just now, saying it out loud. That is possibly the kindest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years. I'm not very good at saying things. I wanted you to know I noticed. Grace noticed before either of us did, I think. She usually does." Rebecca reached across the table. He took her hand. Neither said anything else for a while, and the silence was not the careful silence of the past 7 weeks. It was a different kind entirely. They told the children together the next morning over breakfast, in plain terms suited to a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old, that they had decided, beyond the practical arrangement, that they wanted to be married properly, in the way that meant something more than paper, and that they had wanted Grace and Caleb to know first. Caleb, who was 9 and had been quietly observing the household with more attention than anyone realized, said, "I figured that already," which made Nathaniel laugh in a way Rebecca had not heard from him before. Grace looked between the two of them for a moment, then said, "Does this mean you're really my mama now, not just staying?" Rebecca came around the table and knelt to Grace's eye level. "Yes, Grace, I'm really your mama now. I think, honestly, I have been for a little while, but yes, now it's official too."
Grace threw her arms around Rebecca's neck, and Rebecca held her, and over the girl's shoulder she looked at Nathaniel, who was watching with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something unguarded that he usually kept carefully put away. The mended dress hung in Rebecca's wardrobe for the rest of her life.
She wore it often in the early years until it finally wore through beyond even her careful needlework. When Grace, years later, asked why her mother kept a dress clearly too worn to wear, Rebecca told her, "It was the dress I was wearing when someone first called me Mama." Some things you keep not because you need them, but because of what they remind you happened. What this story carries, underneath the porch lamps and the mended seams, is something simple enough to fit in one sentence. Love in a family is not always built in a single moment of romance. It is built in small, repeated acts of showing up, of choosing patience over judgment, and of letting a child's honest heart say what the adults are too careful to say themselves. That is the quiet, lasting lesson worth carrying out of it.